Chosen one, there are people in your life and forces in the spiritual realm aligned against your destiny who made a decision about you. Not a casual observation or a passing opinion, but an actual settled conclusion that was reached after watching your situation long enough to feel confident in its permanence. They looked at the closed door standing before you. They watched it remain closed through seasons of prayer and belief and patient endurance. They observed you standing before it through the disappointment of repeated seasons where breakthrough seemed imminent and then did not arrive. And they reached a conclusion that they communicated to each other, and perhaps even to you directly, through the language of doubt, through the voice of discouragement, through the quiet but persistent suggestion that maybe the door was closed for a reason that would not be changing anytime soon. They called it permanent. They looked at the sealed door of your situation, your promise, your breakthrough, your restoration, and they declared it finished, done, beyond the point of reversal. The kind of closed that does not open again regardless of how much faith is applied or how many prayers ascend on its behalf. They were wrong. They have always been wrong about you. And today heaven is releasing a word that will redefine how you see the door that your enemies celebrated as permanently sealed. That door is opening, not explosively or dramatically in a way that announces itself to every observer simultaneously, but quietly, steadily, with the specific quality of movement that belongs to a door being opened not by human effort or natural circumstance, but by the hand of God working in the unseen dimension of your situation with a precision and a thoroughness that your enemies did not account for when they declared the door permanently closed. The opening has already begun, and nothing your enemies can do will stop what God has started. Understanding your enemies, before we go deeper into what God is doing with this door, chosen one, it is important to establish clarity about who your enemies actually are in this context. Because the word enemy can trigger images of dramatic adversaries engaged in obvious and deliberate opposition. And while that dimension of spiritual warfare is real, the enemies relevant to this message often operate in far more subtle and varied forms. Some of your enemies are people, not necessarily people who hate you with conscious malice or deliberate cruelty. Sometimes the most damaging enemies of your destiny are people who love you, but whose faith is smaller than the promise over your life. People who care about you genuinely, but whose assessment of what is possible for your situation is limited by their inability to see what God sees when He looks at you and your future. People who speak discouragement without intending destruction, who offer resignation as wisdom, who suggest the lowering of expectations as kindness, when it is actually a subtle agreement with the enemy's agenda for your life. Some of your enemies are internal. The voice of doubt that has learned to sound so much like your own reasonable thinking that you struggle to identify it as foreign. The pattern of expectation management that developed through repeated disappointments and gradually shifted your faith from open anticipation to guarded hoping. The agreement you may have unconsciously reached with the conclusion that the door was closed, the internal settlement that occurred somewhere in a long season of waiting, when your spirit quietly stopped, expecting the door to open, even while your words continued, affirming that it would. And some of your enemies are spiritual forces in the invisible realm that have been assigned specifically to maintain the appearance of closure over the doors of your destiny. Forces that have worked through human voices and circumstantial evidence and the prolonged experience of unanswered prayer to construct the most convincing case possible that the door before you is beyond the reach of any faith you could exercise. All of these enemies reached the same conclusion about your door, all of them invested in the declaration of its permanent closure. And all of them are about to be confronted with the evidence that they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the God who holds the keys to every door over every chosen life he has ever created. Why the door looked permanently closed, chosen one, let us be honest about something that requires courage to acknowledge. The door did not just look permanently closed to your enemies. There were moments, perhaps many moments, when it looked permanently closed to you as well, when you stood before it in prayer and felt nothing move, when you declared the promise over it and heard only silence in return, when you watched season after season pass without the movement you were believing for and felt the conclusion of permanence beginning to form in your own spirit, even as you resisted giving it full voice. This honesty is not a confession of failed faith. It is the authentic acknowledgement of what a genuine season of closed-door waiting actually feels like from the inside. And God honors that honesty far more than he is honored by performances of confidence that do not match the interior reality of the waiting heart. The door looked permanently closed for several reasons that are worth understanding. First, it was designed to look that way. The enemy understood that if he could not permanently close the door, his best alternative strategy was to make it appear permanently closed for long enough to produce the agreement of permanence in your spirit. Because a chosen heart that internally agrees with the permanence of a closed door stops pressing against it, stops expecting it to move, stops positioning itself to walk through it when it opens. And a chosen heart positioned away from a door at the moment of its opening can miss the very breakthrough it has been praying for through the entire season of waiting. Second, the door looked permanently closed because the opening was happening in a dimension you could not see from your position. The work on the door was not absent during the seasons when nothing visible appeared to be changing. It was happening beneath the surface, in the spiritual dimension of your situation, in the hidden spaces where God does his most thorough and consequential work before allowing it to express itself in the visible realm. The lock was being worked on from the inside. The hinges were being prepared for movement. The mechanism of the door's opening was being carefully and precisely engineered by hands you could not see from your side of the door. Third, the door remained visibly closed for longer than seemed necessary because the opening required preparation on your side of the door as well as on the other side of it. The person who walks through an open door into what God has prepared needs to be prepared to receive, steward, and sustain what is waiting on the other side. And the preparation of a chosen heart for the fullness of what God has prepared is a work that cannot be rushed without producing a person who enters blessing prematurely and is unable to carry it well. The door was not opened until the preparation of both dimensions, the promise and the person called to receive it, reached their simultaneous completion. The quiet nature of this opening heaven specifically wants you to understand the quiet nature of the opening that is currently underway, chosen one. Because quietness is not weakness. The quiet opening of this door is not a lesser version of what a dramatic, instantaneous breakthrough would have been. It is a specific and intentional quality of divine movement that carries its own extraordinary power and purpose. When God opens a door quietly, he is doing something that a dramatic and sudden opening could not accomplish. He is allowing the opening to develop fully and completely before the enemies who declared the door permanently closed have time to mount a coordinated response to the movement. A sudden and dramatic opening announces itself to everyone watching, including those who would organize opposition to what the opening is releasing. But a quiet opening, a gradual and steady movement that occurs in the spiritual dimension before it fully expresses itself in the visible one, can advance far beyond the point of reversal before the opposition even recognizes that the door is no longer sealed. Your enemies declared the door permanently closed. And in their confidence in that declaration, they relaxed their vigilance around it. They stopped watching it for movement because they were certain movement was no longer possible. And into that gap of relaxed vigilance, God began moving the door with a quietness that their inattention allowed to progress further than their opposition would have permitted if they had been paying closer attention. By the time the opening is fully visible to every observer, chosen one, it will already be too advanced for any opposition to stop. The door will not merely be cracked open or slightly ajar in a way that continued pressure could reclose. It will be standing open in a way that reflects the full and irreversible decision of the God who holds authority over every door of every destiny he has ever designed. The quietness was strategy, and the strategy is working in your favor right now. What is on the other side of this door, chosen one? Let us speak about what is waiting for you on the other side of the door that your enemies thought was permanently closed. Because understanding the fullness of what the opening reveals will strengthen your resolve to keep pressing toward the threshold and your faith to walk through it completely when the opening has fully manifested. On the other side of this door is a restoration that specifically addresses the areas of your life that were most affected by the season of the closed door. The length of your waiting has not diminished what waits on the other side. In fact, the extended season of the door being closed has increased what will flow through it when the opening is complete. Because God does not simply restore what was lost through the seasons of waiting, He restores with interest. He returns what the enemy held back with an addition that accounts for the length and the depth of the withholding. What comes through this open door will exceed what you lost by a measure that will leave you understanding that even the closed door season was working in your favor in ways that your natural perspective was unable to perceive at the time. On the other side of this door is a vindication that the long season of your enemy's confidence in its permanent closure makes more powerful than a vindication that came quickly could ever have been. The longer the enemy invests in the declaration of a door's permanent closure, the more dramatic the testimony that door's opening produces when it finally comes. Every person who agreed with your enemy's assessment of your situation will witness the opening of this door and be confronted with the evidence that their agreement with the enemy's conclusion was a fundamental misreading of the situation. Your testimony will not be the testimony of someone whose door opened quickly. It will be the testimony of someone whose door opened after the enemy's best and most sustained effort to keep it closed. And that testimony carries a weight and a power that will reach hearts and restore faith in people who have also been standing before doors that seemed permanently closed. On the other side of this door is a purpose that the preparation season made you uniquely qualified to step into. Every day you stood before the closed door and chose to keep believing rather than walking away from the promise was a day that added to the specific preparation the other side of the door required. The patience developed through the waiting, the depth of faith forged through the prolonged testing, the intimacy with God deepened through the seasons of pressing against a door that would not yet move. All of it produced the version of you that the other side of this door required, and that version of you is now standing at the threshold of its moment, what your enemies did not account. For chosen one, when your enemies declared this door permanently closed, they made several critical miscalculations that are directly relevant to why the door is opening now, in spite of their confident declaration. They did not account for the faithfulness of God. They observed the closed door and concluded that God was either unable or unwilling to open it. They factored his silence during the waiting season as agreement with their assessment of permanence. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of divine silence. God's silence is not consent to the enemy's agenda. It is the specific quiet that accompanies the most careful and thorough work. The silence of a surgeon operating is not the silence of inactivity. It is the silence of focused and skilled intervention at the deepest level. God's silence through your long waiting season was the silence of his most careful and consequential work on both sides of the door that appeared closed. They did not account for the persistence of your faith. Your enemies expected the closed door to eventually produce a withdrawal of faith that would make the closure self-fulfilling. They expected disappointment to compound into agreement with their conclusion. They expected the weight of the waiting to eventually cause you to walk away from the door and settle for a life defined by its absence. But you did not walk away. You remained. You continued pressing against the closed door with every resource of faith available to you through season after season of visible unresponsiveness. And that persistence is precisely what the spiritual work on the other side of the door required to reach its completion. They did not account for the timing of God. Your enemies evaluated the closed door through the lens of human timing, which concludes that a door closed long enough is a door closed permanently. But God does not operate within the boundaries of human timing. He operates from the perspective of eternity, where no door closed within time is beyond the reach of divine reversal. And his timing for the opening of this door is not governed by how long it has been closed, but by when the preparation of every element of the opening has been completed to his satisfaction. That completion has now been reached, and the opening that your enemies' timing told them would never come is already underway. How to position yourself for the full opening, chosen one. As the door continues its quiet opening, your positioning in relation to it matters deeply. Because a door opening quietly, while the person it was opened for is looking in a different direction, can complete its opening without producing the immediate breakthrough it was designed to release. The enemy knows this, and he will use every distraction available to him to pull your attention away from the door at the precise moment when attentiveness to its movement is most critical. Position yourself at the door through sustained and expectant prayer. Not the exhausted and going through the motions prayer of someone who has been waiting too long to fully believe their words are producing any result, but the alert and attentive prayer of someone who has received the news that the door they have been praying about is already opening, and whose prayer is now less a petition for the opening to begin and more a partnering with the opening that is already underway. Position yourself at the door through declarations of what God has said about it, rather than agreements with what your enemies have said. Every time you speak the promise over the door, rather than the enemy's conclusion about it, you are adding your voice to the divine momentum of the opening. You are aligning yourself with what heaven has already decided, rather than with what your enemies confidently declared. And that alignment produces a spiritual positioning that ensures you will be at the threshold when the door reaches its full and complete open position. Position yourself at the door through the practical preparation of someone who genuinely expects to walk through it. Begin making the interior and sometimes the practical preparations that walking through this door will require, not as a presumptuous act of claiming something not yet fully manifested, but as a faith declaration that you receive the news of the opening and are preparing yourself to respond appropriately to what God is releasing. The door is opening, chosen one. Receive this final declaration with every part of your believing spirit. The door that your enemies called permanently closed is opening right now. The opening that they said would never come is already underway. The reversal that they declared impossible is being accomplished by the hands of the God who holds every key to every door of every destiny he has ever designed. Your enemies miscalculated. They underestimated the faithfulness of God. They underestimated the persistence of your faith. They underestimated the timing of heaven and the thoroughness of the preparation that the opening required. And they will witness the full expression of their miscalculation when the door they declared permanently closed stands open before you in a way that leaves no room for any explanation other than divine faithfulness to a chosen heart that refused to stop believing. The door is opening, chosen one. Position yourself at the threshold. The God who began the opening will complete it. And what walks through this door into your life will exceed every promise that your enemies believed they had permanently prevented from being fulfilled. Type Amen if you receive this declaration today. Share this message with someone whose closed door needs the encouragement of knowing that God is already working on the opening that their enemies declared would never come.